Hey guys, in this video I'm going to give you a real-world review of this camera, the Sony RX100 Mark VII. And by real world, I mean I'm going to tell you my impressions after using this camera in the Southeast Asia region for the past 6 to 7 weeks. We have spent time in Thailand and we have been in Myanmar. We are currently in southern Thailand. And spoiler alert, this camera is freaking amazing. In this review, I'm going to tell you my likes and my dislikes with regard to the Sony RX100 Mark VII. I'm not going to give an exhaustive list of technical specifications because you could find that information pretty much anywhere. I'm going to tell you what I really think about the camera after using it for several weeks. Let's face it, camera sales are down, and that's because cell phone sales are up. These days, we're all carrying around really good cameras in our pocket in the form of our cell phones. So as time goes by, you may find yourself asking, do I need to carry any extra camera besides my phone? That's a personal decision. But what Sony has done with this version of the RX100 is set it apart from cell phone cameras. For certain photographers, you're going to want something like this in your pocket in addition to your cell phone. Let me first tell you my frame of reference. This is my 4th RX100 that I have owned. I owned the RX100 Mark II, the Mark IV, the Mark V-A, and now this, the Mark VII. There are a couple of really key differences in this camera that I think set it far apart from the RX100s I've owned previously. The first is the autofocusing system. The autofocusing system of this camera is absolutely incredible. What Sony has done, apparently, is take the guts of a Sony A9, which is the flagship camera that Sony sells to professional sports photographers, and in terms of autofocus, they put those same guts into this little RX100. So I'm thinking of this as kind of a baby A9. Focus is incredibly fast. We're talking, they claim 0.02 of a second. More importantly, if there is a human being in the frame of reference, the eyeball is immediately put into focus. How many times have you taken photos of people and been disappointed when you reviewed the photograph to discover that an eye was out of focus, making the entire photograph a throwaway? Well, you're not going to have that problem very often with this camera. And on top of the brilliantly fast autofocus is an insane frames per second rate. You can shoot 20 frames per second all day long with this camera. I don't know what the buffer is, but it does take a little time to clear photos out of the buffer when you're shooting at that kind of frame rate. But what this allows you to do, if you are on the street and you see an interesting individual, you can point your camera at that individual. The camera is going to find their face, find the eye, and then you can fire off 50 shots in a matter of a couple of seconds. So it's wonderful for street photography, action photography. You know, if somebody's ripping past you on a motor scooter or in a long-tail boat, it's going to find that person and lock onto them. And it sticks like glue with regards to the focus tracking system. So I love the autofocus and I love that frames per second. Yes, you're going to end up with thousands of images that you may have to wade through. But these days, storage is cheap, and if you take photographs you want to throw away, you throw them away. Pick the winners, and those can be the ones that you hang on your wall if you're into that. A third key difference between this RX100 and previous models is the lens. And this is a bit of a controversial change that Sony made in, I believe, the Mark VI and now in the Mark VII. The zoom extends out to 200 millimeters. So instead of a faster low light lens that we had in previous generations of RX100, we have a lens that goes 24 millimeter to 200 millimeter. Personally, I prefer the longer lens, because if you're doing any kind of street photography and you don't want to get up in somebody's face, this allows you to get close to your subject without crowding your subject. So from a travel perspective, I've found the zoom lens much more useful than the 24 to 70 lens in previous generations. Now that lens had a little bit faster aperture. This lens has a variable aperture, and when you extend it all the way out, you might be working at f/4.5. There's a 1-inch sensor inside, and it's an upgraded sensor. This is not the same sensor that was contained in the original RX100. They've improved the sensor over the years. The sensor responds better to low light scenarios, and I think the computational photography inside the firmware is better than it used to be. So I will gladly trade a little bit of speed in terms of aperture in exchange for that range. I love the integrated viewfinder, and I find myself mostly using the viewfinder. And I also like the flip screen. After years and years of requests, Sony finally listened to us and they gave us the flip screen we've been wanting. It's not perfect. In fact, it can be rather frustrating if you're trying to shoot video. You're going to need to carry some sort of bracket. I wish the flip screen extended up. Like, they need to come up with some sort of extension that lifts the screen a little bit higher above the camera body. But overall, at least we finally now have a flip screen. So all of this adds up to a pocketable camera. And yes, I can slip this into a pants pocket or a shirt pocket that does some things that a cell phone cannot yet do, especially in terms of the zoom range. And I think that's a key reason that Sony chose to change the lens. And in terms of that instant eye autofocus and 20 frames per second. This thing is a beast. And Sony also, in this generation, finally included a microphone input. So if you want to travel and use this camera as a vlogging camera, if you want to use it as a video camera, if you want to use it as a baby A9 stills camera, you can do all of the above. And I do believe that the lens is quite sharp and the stabilization works very well, even in video. And I've taken video with this camera from moving platforms like boats, and especially if you're shooting in 1080p, full HD, you're gonna get smooth, stable, steady video. There are a lot of other gee whiz features in this camera. For example, the high frame rate settings are insane. If you're into shooting that ultra slow motion type of video, you can do that with this camera. I will point out, the camera has a pretty nice onboard flash. The same flash they've been using for years, but I like that you can tilt it backwards and use it as a bounce flash for a more pleasing flash when you need to draw upon a flash. So I've told you many likes about the camera. Overall, I really think this is the ultimate travel camera. To have a piece of gear this powerful that fits in the palm of your hand is really unique. And I was frankly blown away. Coming from previous generations of the RX100, like I said, the 2, the 4, and the 5, I thought were fine little cameras, but this one is several levels above what I'd had previously. But having told you many of my likes about the camera, let's talk about what I don't like about the camera. Well, as I pointed out, although I like the flip screen, it needs to extend taller, and a lot of people are going to complain about the handling of this camera. I've heard it referred to as a bar of soap and that it can be kind of slippery. For me, a wrist strap is an absolute necessity. It's a must. I haven't dropped this camera yet, but I always have a strap on it. With regard to the controls are average at best. I mean, in terms of actually setting the various settings of the camera, a lot of you are going to find that somewhat frustrating because you don't really have any good tactile wheels, and the buttons are almost purely flush against the body. Movie button is not in the greatest of locations. But these are handling issues that have plagued the RX100 since its introduction many years ago. And I think it's just intrinsic. If you're gonna have a tiny camera that fits in your pocket, there are gonna be some compromises with regard to handling. One change that I've made to my camera that I think is actually a very significant improvement is I got some little stickers at an arts and crafts store and fashioned for myself a little red button on the top of the camera. And not only does this give me a better shutter response and feel, but if I ever hand my camera to someone else and say, hey, would you grab a photo for me when I'm traveling, they can easily identify the shutter button because it's a big, bright red button on the top of the camera. So, Sony RX100 Mark VII, is it worth the price? Well, that's a key question because Sony is not giving these things away, sadly. The price of the RX100 has steadily climbed over the years, and I think this is mainly a reflection of the market. Fewer cameras are being sold these days, and so with a shrinking market, they are increasing the amount of profit per camera. And you could also say it reflects the technology inside the camera to a degree. They're charging more, but they know that it's arguably worth more. I absolutely think it's worth it if you want to bring a separate camera and you don't feel like lugging around a bunch of interchangeable lens cameras and bodies and lenses. Then RX100 is kind of a do-it-all little camera. In fact, I would say I could probably travel with this as my primary camera. Now, here in Southeast Asia, I brought a video camera, I bought my APS-C Sony camera, I brought a little action camera, and I brought a drone. Okay, this doesn't fly up in the air, but I could probably travel with one of these and a tiny travel drone and be completely satisfied. So that's a look at the Sony RX100 Mark VII. If you hadn't figured it out, I love this little camera. It is an absolute beast. If you want to read more reviews of this camera, you guessed it, there will be a link in the description beneath this video. You can click that link and it will take you to this exact product. I'm super happy with it and very glad that I brought it with me on this trip. Until next time, thank you guys for tuning in. I'm going to be doing more videos on this channel about a variety of topics. We're gonna focus, of course, as always, on imaging equipment, various video and still image cameras and drones, but we'll also talk about some other topics and travels from time to time that don't fit on the other channel I produce called Long Long Honeymoon. Until next time, thanks as always, guys, for tuning in. Thanks for subscribing to this tiny little channel over here. I hope we can have some fun with this channel in the months to come. I'm Sean. We're in Thailand. This is my channel, whatever it's called, but I'm gonna give you a low, low ho. See you next time, guys. So good.